Welcome or welcome back to another lesson video by me, Mr. Karabi. I teach at the Arts Academy at Benjamin Rush. Behind me is a virtual background from Costa Rica. So in case anybody wants to know where I got this image from, it's a video from Costa Rica that I have on loop behind me in my virtual window. So looking forward to this unit. We are talking about the sexual health unit, and this is a pretty simple introduction that's probably going to be longer than we actually do in class. To be candid, the beginning of this is very much common sense. The second half of this is a required lesson from the Advocate for Youth 3R's curriculum. And then that part we'll talk about in class. And then the rest of the time for the first two lessons in class are going to be a moving survey where we take questions and we be able to have a conversation about those in class. Door can be shut and you can opt out of answering any of the questions or prefer not to answer section. But we're going to do a moving survey where people move to agree, or disagree, or not sure about a wide variety of questions involving sexual health, none of which will be private. But sometimes it gets personal, so I'll say that. So anybody that has anything that's private, they'll opt out of that particular question or that activity as a whole with no repercussions. But we're talking about the intro to the unit. So a previous video showed you the unit page, and I kind of went over what the unit was about and where the assignments were and the topic pages and stuff like that. But this is a unit intro to sexual health in general. I would like to point out again, before we go any further, that part of the sexual health unit, all of the sexual health curriculum is promoted, I guess I should say, sponsored, I don't know, by the School District of Philadelphia to use a specific resource called the 3R's curriculum. The 3R's curriculum stands for Rights, Respect, and Responsibility. And more or less, it was created by a group called the Advocates for Youth. And the Advocates for Youth was an arm of the CDC, I believe, or maybe it was funded by the CDC, I don't know. But we adopted the curriculum in the School District of Philadelphia in 2019. It's considered comprehensive but inclusive. They're very careful in the words that they use to be able to bring the message to all students, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. A perfect example would be saying external condom as opposed to male condom. So a lot of what's driven is from the 3R's curriculum. And there are some other approved resources and approved topics that the School District of Philadelphia has approved over the year with the Curriculum Council. So this particular lesson video is not about anything about specific topics, except for we're going to do an introduction to the unit in terms of vocabulary, which will also include a mandatory lesson from the 3R's curriculum on what sexual orientation means exactly. So with that being said, let's share my screen and bring it up. So this particular page is relatively basic. There's not a lot of information on it. You can see at the top, there's a slideshow that we're going to be looking at here in this Zoom in a moment. You scroll down, there is a CDC report on youth sexual behaviors. It's updated every couple of years. There's a few vocabulary sources that offer offensive terms to avoid and myth versus facts and yellow flag terms. There is a link back to the unit page. This lesson video that I'm making right now is going to be going in this section. I saved the space for it. And there's two different videos talking about the diversity of sex, gender, and sexual orientation. And then you can go back to the unit page. As you scroll down, it talks about the 3R's curriculum, the rights, respect, and responsibility, and be able to explain everything that means. With that being said, comprehensive sexual health education in the 2000s has changed from what parents might remember, depending on when you were raised. If you went to high school in the 60s or 70s, it was more or less about going and learning about how sex works and how pregnancy works and the changes you went through during puberty, and then after they were all done, they're like, but don't have sex. And, and in the 80s, they did an abstinence first education model in the school district of Philadelphia. And then in the very mid 80s, they started promoting condom use to prevent the spread of HIV infections, because we know that the height of the HIV epidemic, of course, was in the 80s. In the early 90s, I graduated from high school in 1993. I'm now dating myself at 48, almost 49 years old. Our sex education had a combination of everything I just said. So it was puberty, it was changes. We did talk about healthy relationships. We talked about abstinence first. We did talk about using condoms, but it was very much based on a binary or heterosexual norm where man and woman would be able to have sex together. And obviously, well, we know, if nothing else, even if you just pay attention to movies, television, and the media, we know that the diversity of sexual orientation is so much more prominent nowadays. And now that we're in the year 2024, this 2023-2024 school year, I think it's safe to say that we are aware that everybody, I keep waving the students not to come in, that we are aware that the diversity of sexual orientation, labels, vocabulary is ever changing and ever more, how should I put this, in some cases confusing. But I also want to point out, and I don't know why I had this share screen on for so long, but I'm just going to keep it on. I would also like to point out that today's young people are under pressure more so than ever before not to have sex, because statistically speaking, the young people nowadays overall are waiting longer than they were in the 80s, early 90s to go what we would consider all the way to have full-fledged sexual encounters and sexual intercourse. Yeah, the touchy-feely thing still happens at younger ages, but in terms of like a young person saying yes at sex, in whatever that meant in their mind, it is increasingly becoming a process that's starting later in life. Everybody would hope in the past, in the 70s and 80s, that people waited until marriage, but we know that the percentage of young people getting married now is declining. And but in terms of average age of first sexual encounters, if you look at the CDC's sexual report that I pointed out a few minutes ago, or you look at the youth risk behavior study statistics, overall, young people tend to be waiting a little bit longer into high school, and even in some cases post-high school ages, for their first times voluntarily to be able to have consensual sex. So nowadays, the topics do include vocabulary. They do a lot about decision-making, but they also talk a lot about consent and rules involving consent. So with that being said, speeding through the beginning and then slowing down towards the required part of the lesson, I did want to point out that I said sexual health and sexuality, not sex ed. Most schools call this unit the human sexuality unit. And as I mentioned in a previous video, traditional sex ed speaks about, or maybe earlier in this video, I forget now, I just did 2 videos in a row. Traditional sex ed speaks about the processes of pregnancy and growth and development, like puberty changes and things like that. And pregnancy should have been taught in 7th, 8th, or 9th grade. And 9th grade, it could also be included in biology class, but it is not part of the general curriculum anymore for sexual health education for the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So we definitely have pages about pregnancy, but they need to be able to look that up on their own when the time comes. We're also never going to do a step-by-step guide of how to or how you should. And it will focus, as I've mentioned, on self-reflection, decision-making, advocacy, understanding health and safety involving sexual health. So the term sexuality itself, particularly human sexuality, is a difficult term to define because it means different things for different people. So 2 generally universally decided definitions are definition 1, any way in which a person's gender, identity, biological sex, sexual orientation, or intimate relations manifest through a person's personality, and how humans experience and express themselves as sexual beings. So just to go and pull these out, like everybody needs to identify who they are. The pressures these days, as I mentioned, are greater for you to decide who you are as a sexual being at a young age, which is not fair. And it probably shouldn't even be something that's pressure. It should be something that comes naturally to each individual as a person. But humans are sexual beings by nature. We reproduce through sex. We use sex as pleasure. There are different rules about sex in a completely neutral health teacher perspective. Different cultures say different things about who can and can't have sex, how often sex should happen, and different things like that. Well, the same question comes with a young person. Whether or not they even want to be sexually active is part of human sexuality, but understanding who they are as a sexual being, understanding how they portray themselves in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, how they present themselves, these are all parts of human sexuality, which is different than sex. They are often observable behaviors, but not always. So if sex is different than human sexuality, then what are we talking about? Well, obviously we have sex as an identifier. And of course, it's more appropriate to say sex assigned at birth, as opposed to just sex. We could say anatomical sex, which would mean external body parts. We could say biological sex, but most people prefer the phrase sex assigned at birth. And a 2017 ruling by the Supreme Court actually made that Title VII would include gender and gender identity and sex as synonyms. If you want to take their literal definitions, sex is a biological determination of usually based on chromosomes, XX or XY, and of course, identified with the external and internal parts. And gender tends to be a social construct, but of course, with the increase of acceptance of transgender and non-binary personas, we also have a change in vocabulary. So in 2017, like I said, there was a Supreme Court ruling that Title VII would include gender and gender identity and sex as synonyms based on what a person's gender identity was or is. I don't know, was in past tense because of 2017, I was saying. But in any case, when people are filling out applications and it sees the term sex, it doesn't mean yes or no, like sex, yes. No, it really is asking for gender. It's asking how somebody identifies. And a lot of times forms nowadays will have male, female, non-binary. Often, sometimes, if it's a very specific medical institution, it might say male, female, neither or both. But like generically speaking, like government forms are now saying male, female, and non-binary. So we have sex as an identifier, and it's important. Then, of course, we also have sex as sexual activity and sexual intimacy. So intimate activities are basically anything that involves touch. Usually it's skin-to-skin contact. Now, that can be as simple as touching someone's hand and tickling their arm. It could be something as like sharing a straw. Not all intimacy is sexual at all, but intimacy is a closeness. It's a closeness that could have fluid exchange. It could spread disease. It's a closeness that involves touch, like I already said. But when you're talking about sex, and not just intimacy, but sexual intimacy, sexual activity or any intimate activities that promote sexual pleasure, relationship bonding, or reproduction. You can have sexual activities that one performs with themselves, not to get into any of those answers that make people feel uncomfortable watching this, but you do have sexual activity for these reasons. And depending on your answer to the question, what role do you want sex to play in your life, depends on which one of these is more prominent for you, whether it's just reproduction or just relationship bonding or just sexual pleasure, or is it a combination of both things? Is it a combination of sexual pleasure and relationship bonding? Is it a combination of relationship bonding or reproduction? Is it a combination of sexual pleasure and reproduction? So what role do you want sex to play in your life will determine on what this means. Before we go any further, and I don't know what the next slide is. Hello, next slide. Before we go any further and go to the mandatory slides, I do want to point out that the difference between sexual activity and vaginal sexual intercourse. Sexual activity is any act of sexual intimacy. It's usually involving someone's either genitals or private areas or sensitive areas. And as we pointed out, I have to go back. As we pointed out, it can be, oh, there it is. It could be for sexual pleasure, relationship bonding, or reproduction. Sexually transmitted infections, sexually transmitted disease can spread through any sexual activity. So whether it's vaginal sexual activity, anal, oral, whether it is two partners sharing touchy-feely kind of fondling things, disease can spread. So we must take precautions to protect in all different types of sexually transmitted infections. On a future video or a future topic in this class, you will be able to see some ways or hear some ways or read some ways to be able to protect oneself from the spread of sexually transmitted infections. Of course, we learned in middle school or earlier than that, or maybe you didn't learn in school and you just know because, you know, it's nature, or maybe your parents had the conversation with you, if you're a student watching this, that vaginal sexual intercourse between a penis and a vagina is the only way that person can get pregnant from sexual activity. So sexually transmitted infections can be spread through any sexual activity, but vaginal intercourse is the only way you can get somebody pregnant. And that sounds like common sense, but that's something that we need to point out because since the 80s, the number of teen pregnancies has steadily declined, whereas the number of positive cases of sexually transmitted infections, especially chlamydia and gonorrhea, has skyrocketed in this country and in certain cities. Students might be waiting longer or might not be participating in vaginal intercourse, depending on their sexual orientation and experimentation at their age, but they are still spreading sexually transmitted infections, so we need to be careful with that. That being said, the following pages are not my design. They are a website a PowerPoint created by Advocates for Youth from the Rights, Respect, and Responsibility curriculum, as noted. So a lot of this is sort of common sense, but I'm going, because of our 11th grade students, but I'm going to go through it anyway. So what is sexual orientation? And sexual orientation is defined as the gender or genders of the people to whom we are romantically, physically, emotionally, or sexually attracted to. Now, there's something that we need to take into consideration when we say these things. And there are some bullet points here talking about it can include more than one gender. And you can know one's orientation, but here's the thing, you can know one's orientation without necessarily doing something sexual with another person. So sometimes I get annoyed the way that the school district talks to us about professional development. They'll talk to us so much about, there's just this assumption that everyone is having sex, that everyone is sexually active, and that's just not the case. We know that statistically speaking and data speaking, that a lot of young people tend to wait. We recognize as health teachers that there's a significant amount of young people still sexually active. And even if they weren't, they need to be able to understand the tools to be able to keep them safe. But we have to recognize first that, not first, but we have to recognize still that with this, students being sexually active, there's an equal number of students that are not sexually active, but are still trying to find who they are as a sexual being. And that's what sexual orientation specifically is. Is sexual orientation a misleading term? If you were in class, I would wait a few minutes for you to think about this. You can pause this if you really want to think about this, or if you're watching this with your parents. But the answer is yes, sexual orientation is a misleading term. You can be romantically, physically, or emotionally attracted to someone without being interested at all in sexual activity. You really can. Sorry for that pause. I had an interruption. Anyway, you don't have to be sexually active to know what your sexual orientation is. And it's okay if you don't really know what your sexual orientation is. Again, different cultures say different things about this in terms of the acceptance or not acceptance. And there's still people that are struggling to be accepted by, in some cases, society, in some cases, their family, based on their sexual orientation. But generally speaking, sexual orientation is who you romantically, who you physically, who you're emotionally attracted to. Doesn't have anything to do necessarily with sex. So there's three components. Sexual orientation has three parts to it. An OBI is the abbreviation, and orientation basically means who you are attracted to, as we just said, but then there's the behavior component to it. How do we behave sexually? Like, what kinds of things do we do, are we willing to do, and when? So this is what we focused on as a health education class, not necessarily getting people to identify who they are, because that's not our role. They need to do that on their own. But having them stay safe and make safer choices once they do identify who it is that they're attracted to and what they want to do. Obviously, abstinence is the only 100% way to prevent unwanted pregnancy and the spread of sexually transmitted infections. We also talk about ways to protect oneself physically and emotionally when it comes to sexual decision-making. So that's the behavior aspect of it. And then there's identity. That's the label we have, like what we call ourselves as sexual beings. And the common ones are heterosexual and homosexual and bisexual. And so we have to recognize that gender identity and sexual orientation are different things. So you might identify as a particular gender, but you might not. Which sexual orientation is something different. So just like our personalities and sense of self, our sexual and identity can be really important. And identity, in this case, overrules behavior. So there are different yellow flag terms that we're going to go over in class as well. Many people still use the term sexual preference rather than sexual orientation. And the bottom line is, every person has a right to identify however they wish. Others need to respect who that person is, even if that person's identity doesn't make sense to them. And no matter who you are attracted to or sexual with, you have a responsibility to keep that relationship safe and practice safer sex for yourself and your partners. With that being said, there is a video that might be shown in class, it might not, depends on timing. And there's resources on the teacher's portal to be able to explain more. With that said, if you have any questions, email me, talk to me in person. Have a great day.